It was one of those quiet Thursday afternoons where the world outside felt miles away. The sky had that soft, pale gray hue that only comes in early spring, and the drizzle tapping against the windows made the house feel even more still than usual. My husband, Mark, was away on business in Seattle for the week. He left 2 days ago, and though I was used to his occasional trips, the silence always took a bit of adjusting. I had just made myself a cup of chamomile tea and was settling into the corner of the living room couch, wrapped in one of those heavy knit throws that made you feel like you were being hugged by age. Memory. I had a book in my lap, something I'd started 3 times, but never managed to get through. And I was half reading, half listening to the rain when the doorbell rang. It startled me, I won't lie. We don't get visitors often during the week, and I wasn't expecting anyone. I set the tea down carefully and padded across the hardwood floor in my slippers, peeking through the little side window. To my surprise, it was Paul Mark's oldest friend from college. I hadn't seen him in months. He lived across town and usually only came around when Mark was home. He had always been warm, polite, even charming in a subtle way, and though we never spent time alone, he had a calming presence that I remembered well. I opened the door, brushing my hair back quickly. I'd probably looked like a mess, no makeup, hair in a loose bun, wearing my coziest and least flattering cardigan. "Paul," I said, confused but not unwelcoming. He smiled with that quiet, familiar grin of his, holding up a brown paper bag. "Hey, Helen, I was nearby picking something up and remembered Mark saying you liked these almond scones from that bakery near Fifth. Thought I'd drop some off. Hope that's not too weird." I blinked, caught off guard. "Oh, that's really thoughtful of you." He handed me the bag, and I stepped aside instinctively. "Come in. You'll catch a cold out there." He hesitated for just a second, as though unsure if it was appropriate. Then he stepped in, shaking off his coat and setting it on the hallway hook like he'd done a dozen times before. The familiarity of it made me smile. We moved into the kitchen, the smell of warm pastry mingling with the faint scent of rain and lavender hand soap. He took a seat at the small breakfast table while I poured us both fresh tea. It all felt so natural, so quietly ordinary, but under the surface there was something I couldn't quite name, a different kind of energy, subtle and slow. "You look well," he said softly, taking the cup from me. I laughed, brushing imaginary dust from my sleeve. "I look like I've been folding laundry and fighting with the thermostat all morning, but thank you." He chuckled, still more composed than most people I know. We really talked, for the first time in what felt like ages. About work, about aging parents, about books and memories, and how fast the years seemed to be flying by. At one point, he mentioned a road trip he and Mark had taken to the Grand Canyon when they were 22, and I found myself laughing at the way he told the story, even though I'd heard it from Mark a dozen times before. Paul had always had a thoughtful way with words. He wasn't flashy or loud. He observed more than he spoke. But today he was more open, more present, maybe because Mark wasn't around, maybe because we were both feeling the weight of time lately. At some point, our conversation drifted toward more personal territory. He asked me how I'd really been doing, and there was something in his tone, gentle, non-judge, mental, that made me feel safe enough to be honest. "I don't know," I said quietly, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. "Some days I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, and then others, I feel like I'm just going through the motions." He nodded, eyes locked with mine. "I get that, more than I'd like to admit." There was a long pause, not awkward, not tense, just heavy with meaning. His gaze lingered a second longer than it should have, and I felt a strange flutter in my chest. I looked away, pretending to fix a crease in the tablecloth. "You ever wonder," he began carefully, "if we settled too easily out of habit or comfort?" I looked up, caught off guard again by his candor. "Sometimes, but I also think life is a series of choices, some small, some big, and maybe some of them aren't really settling. Maybe they're just surviving." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached across the table, resting his hand lightly over mine. His skin was warm, his touch tentative. I didn't move, I didn't flinch. I just looked at him, really looked, and realized how much had gone unsaid over the years. Things that didn't need to be spoken aloud to be felt. The sound of the rain softened. The world seemed to narrow to that single moment. It wasn't romantic, not in the traditional sense. It wasn't inappropriate either. It was human. Two people alone in a quiet house, carrying the weight of years and unspoken emotions, sitting across from each other with nothing but time between them. He withdrew his hand slowly, respectfully, and offered a small smile. "Sorry, I didn't mean to cross a line." "You didn't," I said, my voice almost a whisper. "I just wasn't expecting." "I know," he said. We finished our tea in silence, the atmosphere gentler now, like something unspoken had been acknowledged and set free. As he stood to leave, he looked at me with a softness I hadn't seen in a long time. "Thanks for the tea and the company. Thanks for the scones," I said with a smile. And then he was gone, the door clicking softly behind him, leaving me standing there with the faint smell of almond and rain lingering in the air, and a heart that felt a little heavier but also a little more awake. The next morning I woke earlier than usual. The bed felt too wide without Mark in it, though after 26 years of marriage those stretches of solitude weren't unfamiliar. But this morning it was different. My mind wasn't on Mark. It wasn't even on the long list of errands I'd scribbled into my planner the night before. It was on Paul, on the unexpected conversation, the touch of his hand, the way his eyes had lingered just a second too long. I sat by the window with my coffee, watching the sunrise. The color spread slowly over the horizon, muted pinks, soft oranges, and the light cast a gentle glow over the backyard where the trees still dripped from last night's rain. It should have been a peaceful moment, but my heart kept pulling me back into that kitchen, to the warmth of his hand over mine, the words we hadn't said but somehow still shared. Why did it stay with me? Was it because I missed being seen, really seen? Mark and I had fallen into that silent rhythm of long marriages, the kind where love isn't gone, just quieter. He cared, he provided, he checked in, but there hadn't been tenderness between us in I don't know how long. Paul's visit had reminded me what it felt like to be noticed, to be heard, to feel something stir beneath the surface. Later that day, I was in the garage, digging through a box of old gardening tools, when my phone buzzed. I wiped the dust off my hands and glanced at the screen. Paul. My breath caught for a second, just seeing his name lit up something inside me I wasn't proud of. I tapped the message open. "Hey, Helen, I hope it's okay to text. Just wanted to say I enjoyed yesterday more than I expected to. You've always had a way of making people feel at ease. I hope you're having a good day." I stared at the message for a long time before replying. "It's more than okay. I enjoyed it too. It was nice, comforting even. Thank you for stopping by." I hit send, heart thudding more than it should have. I told myself it was just a message, a simple exchange between two old friends, but deep down I knew something had shifted. Something quiet and delicate, but real. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the way Paul had looked at me like I mattered beyond the surface, like he wanted to know the version of me I didn't show most people anymore. It made me question things I hadn't let myself question in years, not just about my marriage, but about who I'd become, what I'd settled into, what parts of me I'd let fade. The next day was a Saturday, gray and cold. I busied myself with cleaning, anything to keep my hands moving while my thoughts spun in circles. Around noon my phone rang again. It was Paul. I answered, trying to sound casual even though my stomach fluttered. "Hey," he said, "I know it's a little last minute, but there's this exhibit at the museum, photographs from the 60s. You always liked that stuff, right?" I did. Mark hated museums. I hadn't been in years. I was thinking. He continued, "Since Mark's still out of town, and I'm flying out to Denver Monday, maybe you'd want to go. Just friends catching up. No pressure." There was a moment of silence where I imagined the implications not just of going with him, but of what it meant to want to. I could have said no. I could have played it safe, but I said, "Sure, that sounds nice." We met in the museum's parking lot an hour later. He was leaning against his car, arms crossed, a wool coat buttoned up to his neck. He smiled when he saw me, a smile that reached his eyes. And I felt that quiet, impossible pull again. Inside, the museum was hushed and warm, filled with the smell of old paper and cleaned floors. We moved slowly through the exhibit, pausing at black and white images of protest marches, love, struck couples on park benches, gritty city streets frozen in time. We didn't say much, but we didn't have to. Every now and then he'd glance at me, not with expectation, but understanding. It felt like a strange dream, to be standing next to someone who made me feel like I was still full of stories and secrets, like I wasn't just someone's wife or someone's mother, but a whole person. Again, afterward, we walked to a nearby cafe. We sat in a corner, booth with chipped wood and mismatched mugs. Paul asked me about my writing. I'd mentioned years ago that I used to journal, that I even wrote short stories in my 20s. "No one else ever asked me about that anymore. You should still write," he said gently. "Think you've got something to say." I looked at him for a long moment. "So do you." There was a pause. Then quietly he said, "I used to think I'd end up with someone like you." The air between us shifted again, not heavier, but more fragile. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to pull away from the edge. The other part wanted to step closer. I reached for my coffee, my fingers brushing against his. He didn't pull away. Neither did I. We stayed like that for a moment, just a moment before I cleared my throat and said, "It's getting late." He nodded. "I'll walk you to your car." Outside, the air was crisp, and a few cherry blossoms were just beginning to open on the trees by the curb. Spring was coming slowly but surely. As I opened my door, Paul hesitated beside me. "Thank you," he said, "for today, for not making me feel like a fool." "You're not," I whispered. "You're not a fool, Paul." He leaned in, then not a kiss, not quite. His forehead brushed mine, gentle, almost reverent. It was a touch filled with every word we hadn't said, every thought we were still afraid to give voice to. Then he stepped back, gave a small smile, and walked away. I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine. My hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel, and all I could think was, something is waking up in me, something I thought I had buried long ago. The days that followed were a strange mix of normal and not. Mark came back late Sunday evening, his flight delayed due to weather. He was tired, distracted, carrying the usual souvenir mug from the airport gift shop and an unopened box of chocolates from the hotel lobby. I smiled, thanked him, and kissed his cheek the same way I always did, but something inside me had shifted and I couldn't ignore it. I kept thinking about Paul, not just what he said, but how he looked at me like I was more than just someone's wife. It was like a light had flickered on in a room I had forgotten was there. I wasn't looking for anything. I hadn't been unhappy, exactly, but Paul made me feel remembered, seen, like the woman I used to be before time softened my edges and the world told me to be smaller, quieter. On Tuesday, I found myself standing in front of my closet, staring at the old journals stacked neatly on the top shelf. I hadn't opened them in over a decade. I pulled one down, wiped the dust off the leather cover, and sat cross-legged on the floor of our bedroom. My handwriting was younger, then loopier, more confident. I flipped through page after page of stories I had written in my late 30s, some finished, some abandoned halfway through. Dreams, reflections, things I hadn't let myself feel in years. Mark had gone back to his usual rhythm: emails, conference calls, dinner at 7, falling asleep in front of the TV. We were still kind to each other, still shared laughs and little rituals, but we lived like roommates, familiar, dependable, and comfortable, but no longer curious. There was no harm, no betrayal, just quiet detachment. It was Thursday afternoon when Paul messaged again. Just a simple question. Are you free for coffee? No pressure, just, I could use some good company. I hesitated. I stared at the message, heart beating faster than I wanted to admit. Then I typed, yes, same cafe. We met that afternoon. He was already there when I arrived, reading something on his phone, his glasses perched low on his nose. When he looked up and saw me, he smiled like he was genuinely glad I came. We sat by the window this time, the light from the late afternoon sun casting golden shadows on the table. We talked about everything and nothing. I told him about finding my old journals, and he encouraged me again, gently, without agenda, to start writing again. I think you've still got stories in you, he said, real ones. I watched him as he spoke. He wasn't trying to impress me. He wasn't pushing for anything. He just cared. That kind of quiet attentiveness is rare, and it was what made what came next feel even more unexpected. He reached into his coat pocket and handed me a small square envelope. No name, no writing, just soft ivory paper and a simple wax seal. What is this? I asked, confused. He smiled sheepishly. Just something I wrote for you. Not romantic, not dramatic, just thoughts. I wasn't sure I'd even give it to you. I turned the envelope in my hands, uncertain. Do you want me to read it now? No, he said quickly. Later, or not at all. Up to you. We sat in silence for a while. And then, without warning, he said, I think I've always admired you, Helen, not just as Mark's wife, but you, the way you listen, the way you see people. I looked down, flustered. You're saying that now, after all these years. I think I never had the right moment, he said, or the courage. His words hung in the air between us, delicate and dangerous. I'm not looking to make trouble, Helen, he said softly. I would never want to hurt you or Mark. I just needed to say it once. I nodded slowly, unsure of how to answer. He didn't push. He didn't reach across the table. He just sat there, steady and open, waiting. When I got home, the envelope sat in my purse like a hidden ember. I didn't read it right away. I made dinner, folded laundry, laughed at one of Mark's dry jokes about airport food. But when the house went quiet and Mark was asleep upstairs, I tiptoed to the kitchen, turned on the stove light, and carefully peeled the wax seal from the paper. It wasn't long, a page and a half, typed. He wrote about the first time he met me, how I'd made everyone laugh at a backyard barbecue with some sarcastic story about our dog eating Mark's cufflinks. He wrote about how I always made people feel safe in conversation, how I had a way of really listening without making it about me. He wrote about my laugh, how rare it was, but how genuine it sounded. And he wrote about how, over the years, he watched me quietly shrink into the background while everyone else took up space. He ended with one line. I read it over and over again. I just wanted you to know that someone noticed. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, long after the letter was folded again, my hand resting over it like it was something alive. I didn't know what I felt, guilt, maybe, but also a strange sort of peace and a bit of ache. Because when someone sees you, not the version you present to the world, but the quiet corners of who you really are, it's hard to go back to being invisible again. The next morning, I woke before the sun and opened a fresh notebook, and for the first time in years, I began to write. The following week unfolded in slow, gentle waves. Mark settled back into his routine's coffee by 6, the morning paper folded just the way he liked it, and those soft grunts he made when checking email on his tablet, like he was always slightly annoyed at the world but didn't care enough to do anything about it. He was kind, still thoughtful in the ways he knew how to be, but I was beginning to understand that kindness alone couldn't reach the parts of me that had gone quiet for too long. The letter from Paul stayed tucked inside my journal, folded carefully between pages of words that hadn't seen light in years. I hadn't messaged him since. He hadn't either. Maybe he understood I needed space. Or maybe he was giving me room to decide who I really was without interference. One afternoon, Mark came home early. We were in the kitchen, and he stood near the sink, rubbing the back of his neck like he always did when something was on his mind. "You've been different lately," he said, not accusing, just observing. I looked up from the salad I was prepping. "Different how? Quieter, more thoughtful, and you've been writing again, haven't you?" I paused, then nodded. "Yeah, I have." His expression softened. "I think that's good. You used to love it. I always thought you gave it up too easily." His words surprised me. I wasn't sure he'd even remembered that part of me. It felt like no one really noticed. I said carefully that I stopped. He was silent for a moment, then stepped closer and placed a hand on my shoulder. "That's on me. I should have noticed." I wanted to tell him that it wasn't just about noticing. It was about being seen, not just as a wife or the person who made the grocery lists and remembered birthdays, but as someone with layers still unfolding. Someone with questions, longings, moments of doubt, and dreams still unclaimed. But I didn't say that. Not yet. Instead, I smiled gently. "It's okay. I think I stopped noticing myself for a while, too." That night, as we lay in bed, he reached for my hand. It wasn't passion or urgency. It was comfort. And while it didn't answer all the things I was still trying to understand, it reminded me that relationships aren't always about fireworks. Sometimes they're about standing in the quiet together even when you're not sure what comes next. The following weekend, I found myself driving through town alone. I ended up near the park Paul and Mark used to play softball in every summer, back when we were all younger and time felt endless. I didn't plan to go there. It was muscle memory, maybe, or something deeper. I pulled into the gravel lot and parked under a sycamore tree. The branches were bare, but buds had started to appear tiny and determined. I sat there for a few minutes, staring out at the empty field. And then I saw him. Paul was sitting on a bench near the far side of the path, a book in his lap. He hadn't seen me. He looked peaceful, unaware of how much he'd stirred me just by being kind at the right moment. I didn't get out of the car. I just watched, my hands resting on the steering wheel, the same way they had that night after the museum. I wasn't afraid, I wasn't ashamed, I was just still. Maybe in another life, with different choices, things would have been different. Maybe Paul would have been more than a soft memory and a folded letter and a door left ajar. But in this life I had learned something important. He didn't come into my life to take me away. He came to remind me of who I still was. Eventually, I started the engine, turned the car around, and drove home. When I walked through the front door, Mark was in the living room, flipping through the channels. He looked up and smiled. "Hey," he said, "you okay?" "Yeah," I replied, and for the first time in a long while I meant it. "I think I am." I went upstairs, opened my journal, and wrote until the sun dipped below the horizon. Sometimes life doesn't give you answers. It gives you moments, moments that stir something deep and sleeping, moments that ask you to look at yourself and remember. And I remembered the woman I used to be, and I started becoming her.